I never believed in signs from beyond. Not until the morning I found the letter tucked inside Marco's favorite book, the one about Tuscan architecture he'd read 1,000 times. 3 months had passed since the funeral. 3 months of walking through our stone farmhouse like a ghost myself, touching his things, smelling his shirts, trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. The letter was sealed with red wax, old-fashioned, deliberate. My hands trembled as I broke it open. The handwriting was unmistakably his, careful and measured, the way he wrote everything important. "Juliana," it began. Just my name, but I could hear his voice saying it, that soft way he had of turning the A into music. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. I need you to do something for me, something I should have asked you to do years ago, but I was afraid. Drive to Villa Serafina in Montepulciano. You remember, the place I always told you we couldn't visit? I lied about why. The truth is waiting for you there, in a room I prepared only for this moment. Trust me one last time. The key is in my study, behind the photograph of our wedding day." I sat on the edge of our bed for what felt like hours, the letter pressed against my chest. Villa Serafina. He'd mentioned it perhaps twice in all our 23 years together, always with a strange tension in his jaw, always changing the subject when I asked why we never went there. I'd assumed it held painful memories, maybe an old family dispute, a place of loss. Never did I imagine it held secrets meant for me. The autumn light filtered through the bedroom shutters, casting golden stripes across the terracotta floor. Outside, our vineyard stretched toward the horizon, the leaves just beginning to turn bronze and crimson. Marco had planted those vines with his own hands, row after row, telling me each one was a prayer for our future. Now that future felt like a foreign country I'd never learned the language for. But this letter, this impossible letter written by a dead man's hand, was asking me to take one more journey with him. I found the key exactly where he said it would be, a small brass thing tied with a faded ribbon. And in that moment, standing in his study, surrounded by his books and his maps and the faint smell of his tobacco, I realized something that made my breath catch. Marco had been planning this, not just the letter, but everything. He'd known he was dying long before he told me, and he'd spent that time building something I couldn't yet understand. The question that kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling while the house creaked and settled around me, was simple and terrifying. What could be so important that he kept it hidden until death? The drive to Montepulciano took nearly 2 hours, winding through hills striped with vineyards and olive groves. I'd called my daughter Alessia the night before, told her I needed to take care of some paperwork related to the estate. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I couldn't bring myself to mention the letter. Not yet. She'd been so fragile since her father's death, barely holding herself together between her work at the gallery in Florence and her own grief. I needed to understand what I was walking into before I brought her into it. Villa Serafina sat at the end of a cypress-lined drive, its honey-colored stone glowing in the morning light. It was smaller than I'd imagined, not a grand estate, but a refined country house with green shutters and a garden gone slightly wild. An elderly man emerged from the front door before I'd even turned off the engine. He was tall, thin, dressed in clothes that had seen better decades, but were impeccably maintained. "Signora Giuliana Torini?" he asked, his voice formal but warm. "Yes. I'm sorry, My name is Enzo Martelli. Your husband employed me to maintain this property and to wait for you." He held out his hand, and when I took it, I felt the calluses of a man who worked with his hands. "He said you would come when the time was right. I've been expecting you for 3 months now." The words hit me like a physical thing. 3 months? Marco had known, had planned even for the timing of his death. I followed Enzo through the villa, past rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, through hallways that smelled of lavender and old wood. He stopped at a heavy oak door on the second floor. "This room, Signora. He asked that you enter alone. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Take all the time you require." He handed me the brass key and then, with a gentle nod, descended the stairs, leaving me standing in the dim hallway with my heart hammering against my ribs. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The room beyond was nothing like the rest of the villa. Where everything else felt frozen in time, this space was alive. One wall was covered in photographs: our wedding, Alessia as a baby, family dinners, vacations I'd forgotten we'd taken. Another wall held a large map of Tuscany with pins and notes in Marco's handwriting. In the center of the room stood a desk, and on that desk a leather journal and a small recording device, the kind he'd used for his architecture lectures. I pressed play on the recorder, and his voice filled the room. "Juliana, my love, if you're hearing this, I'm so sorry. Sorry for leaving you. Sorry for the secrets. But most of all, sorry that I didn't have the courage to tell you these things while I could still hold your hand." There was a pause, the sound of him taking a breath. "Everything in this room is for you and Alessia. Everything I've done for the past 5 years has been to protect what we built together. I need you to understand why I did that before you judge me." I sank into the chair, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. 5 years. 5 years of secrets. The recording continued, and with each word I felt the ground beneath me shifting, felt a man I thought I knew becoming someone both stranger and somehow more familiar than ever before. But one question burned through everything else, the one I whispered to the empty room as his recorded voice finally fell silent. What had he been protecting us from? The journal was thick, leather-bound, filled with Marco's precise handwriting and dated entries going back 7 years. I started at the beginning, my hands shaking as I turned each page. The early entries were mundane: notes about the vineyard's harvest, sketches of architectural details for a client's renovation, observations about Alessia's progress in her art studies. But then, about 5 years ago, the tone shifted. "Met with Dr. Santoro today. The diagnosis is worse than we feared. 18 months, maybe 2 years if the treatment works. I haven't told Juliana yet. I can't find the words. How do you tell your wife that the life you promised her is being cut in half?" I had to set the journal down. My vision blurred with tears I'd been holding back for months. 18 months. He'd known for so long, and I'd seen nothing. Or had I chosen not to see? I remembered that period now with horrible clarity. How he'd been more attentive, more present, taking time off from his practice to work in the vineyard with me, insisting on weekend trips to places we'd always meant to visit. I thought he was simply entering a new phase of life, becoming more appreciative. I never imagined he was saying goodbye. But the entries that followed weren't about dying. They were about planning. Started transferring assets today. Santoro recommended an estate lawyer, Avocado Leone in Siena. Need to protect everything. The vineyard, the house, Juliana's studio, Alessia's trust. The family will come like vultures once I'm gone. The family. My chest tightened. Marco had 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister who'd barely spoken to us in years. His father had left the family construction business to Marco alone, recognizing his eldest son's talent and dedication, while the others had drifted into other pursuits. The decision had created a rift that never fully healed. At the funeral, I'd seen them watching from the edges of the ceremony, their expressions unreadable. They'd offered brief condolences and then disappeared. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, too lost in my own grief. But Marco had thought about it. Page after page detailed his careful work, consulting with lawyers, establishing trusts, transferring property titles, creating a web of legal protections so complex it made my head spin. He'd anticipated every angle, every possible challenge. There were notes about his brothers, Stefano and Roberto, about their failed businesses and mounting debts, about his sister, Patrizia, and her husband's gambling problems. He'd been watching them, understanding their desperation, and building walls they wouldn't be able to climb. One entry, dated about 2 years ago, made me catch my breath. Juliana found the papers I left on my desk yesterday. I told her they were for a client's estate. She believed me. I hate lying to her, but I can't burden her with this while I'm still here. She needs to remember me as her husband, not as a man planning his own death. But Enzo has his instructions. The villa is ready. When the time comes, she'll understand, and she'll be prepared for what comes next. I looked around the room with new eyes. Every photograph, every document, every piece of this elaborate puzzle, it was all a message. Marco had been trying to tell me something from beyond the grave, trying to prepare me for a battle I didn't even know was coming. The recording device that's silent on the desk, but I knew there were more messages waiting. Part of me wanted to run from this room, to leave these secrets buried and return to my simple grief, but I'd come too far to turn back now. So instead, I picked up the journal again and kept reading, even as one terrible question formed in my mind. If Marco had gone to such lengths to protect us, what exactly was he protecting us from?
3 days after my first visit to Villa Serafina, they came. I was in the vineyard, checking the last of the season's grapes, when I heard car doors slamming in front of the house. Through the rows of vines, I could see 3 figures approaching: Stefano, Roberto, and Patrizia, dressed in city clothes that looked absurdly formal against the rural backdrop. My stomach dropped. In all the years since the funeral, they'd maintained their distance. Their sudden appearance could only mean one thing. "Juliana," Stefano called out, his voice carrying that false warmth I'd learned to recognize at family gatherings. "We've been trying to reach you. You don't answer your phone anymore." I walked toward them slowly, wiping dirt from my hands. "I've been busy with the harvest. What can I do for you?" Patrizia stepped forward, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, though I saw no actual tears. "We need to talk about Marco's estate. It's been months now, and we still haven't discussed the family business, the properties, all the things Papa left to Marco." "There's nothing to discuss," I said carefully. "Marco's will was very clear. Everything was left to Alessia and me." Roberto laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything? Juliana, be reasonable. Marco may have managed the family business, but it belongs to all of us. Papa would have wanted his other children to benefit too. You can't possibly think it's fair for you to keep it all." I'd spent the past 3 days reading Marco's journal, following his careful reasoning, understanding the patterns he'd observed. I recognize this approach now: the appeal to fairness, to family loyalty, the gentle suggestion that I was being selfish. Marco had written about this exact conversation, predicted it down to the words they'd use. "Marco built that business from almost nothing," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Your father left him a failing construction company with more debt than assets. He spent 20 years turning it into something valuable. That was his work, his vision. The will stands as written." Stefano's expression hardened. "We have our own lawyer looking into this. Papa's original will mentioned all of us. Marco's changes may not be legally sound, especially if he made them while he was ill, when his judgment might have been compromised." There it was, the real threat underneath the family concern. They were going to challenge the will, claim Marco wasn't of sound mind when he revised his estate plan. I thought of all those journal entries, the clear, methodical planning, the consultations with multiple lawyers. Marco knew they'd try this. He'd been ready. "Do what you need to do," I said quietly, "but Marco's affairs are in perfect order. He made his decisions carefully and with full legal counsel. You'll find everything is airtight." Patricia's tears vanished, replaced by cold anger. "We grew up in poverty while you lived in this beautiful house, worked this land that should have been divided among all of us. You think you deserve all this? You married into this family, Juliana. We were born into it. That should count for something. I wanted to tell them about the years Marco and I worked 16-hour days to save the business, about the nights we went to bed exhausted and worried, about the sacrifices we made while they pursued easier paths. But Marco's voice echoed in my head from one of his recordings. Don't engage with their grievances. They'll twist everything you say. Just stand firm and let the legal structures do their work. I think you should leave now, I said. If you want to discuss the estate further, your lawyers can contact mine. They left, but not before Stefano turned back with a final warning. This isn't over. We're family, Juliana. You'll find that family has ways of getting what it deserves. As their car disappeared down the drive, I realized my hands were shaking. I walked back into the house straight to Marco's study and called Avvocato Leone in Siena. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and professional. Signora Torini, Marco said you would call when they made their first move. He was correct about the timing, wasn't he? He was correct about everything, I whispered. Then trust his plan, he replied. Everything is in place. Let them challenge the will. Every step they take will only reveal how thoroughly your husband protected you. He was a remarkable man. After we hung up, I sat in Marco's chair, surrounded by his books and his carefully ordered life, and asked the question that had been growing since Stefano's threat. Marco built legal walls, yes, but what if that wasn't enough? What if he'd prepared something more?
The next recording at Villa Serafina changed everything. I'd returned to the villa the following morning, drawn back by questions that wouldn't let me sleep. Enzo greeted me with his usual quiet dignity and a knowing look that suggested he understood more than he said. "There's a second device, Signora," he told me as we stood in the doorway of Marco's room. "He said you'd be ready for it after they came. I can tell by your face that they have." The second recorder was hidden in a drawer beneath the first, wrapped in cloth. I held it in my hands for a long moment before pressing play, somehow knowing that whatever came next would change how I saw everything. Marco's voice emerged, but different this time, tired, slightly rough, as if recorded late at night. "Juliana, if you're listening to this, it means they've shown their hand. They've come for what they think they're owed. I want you to know something that I've never told anyone, not even you, and I need you to understand why." He paused, and I could hear him moving, perhaps pacing as he often did when thinking through complex problems. 30 years ago, when I took over Papa's business, I discovered it wasn't just failing, it was involved in things that weren't entirely legal. Nothing violent or terrible, but corners were being cut, inspections were being dodged, money was being moved in ways that didn't stand up to scrutiny. My father wasn't a bad man, but he was desperate, and desperate men make choices they shouldn't. My breath caught. Marco had never mentioned any of this. In all our years together, he'd spoken of his father with respect, of inheriting a struggling company that he transformed through hard work and integrity. I spent 5 years cleaning it up, 5 years of fixing violations, paying back debts, making everything legitimate. My brothers and sister knew about some of it. They'd worked in the business briefly and had seen things. When Papa wrote his first will, leaving everything divided equally, I went to him and told him I couldn't accept that. Not because I wanted everything for myself, but because I knew they'd use those old problems against me, against us. They'd threatened to expose what Papa had done unless I gave them what they wanted. It would be extortion dressed up as family justice. I understood now. This wasn't just about inheritance or business success. It was about protection from a much older threat. Papa understood. He wrote a new will, left everything to me with the understanding that I'd help my siblings if they truly needed it. But I also made him sign documents that laid out everything he'd done wrong, everything I'd fixed, with timestamps and evidence. Those documents are in a safety deposit box in Siena.
The key is with Avvocato Leone. If my siblings try to blackmail you, if they threaten to destroy my reputation or claim the business was built on corruption, Leone will show them that we have full documentation of everything, including their knowledge of and participation in some of those early problems. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, sadder. I never wanted to use this weapon. I hoped they'd simply accept the will and move on with their lives. But I know them, Juliana. I know how desperation makes people justify terrible things. So I built this safeguard, not to destroy them, but to make sure they can't destroy what we built together, what you and Alessia deserve to keep. The recording clicked off. I sat in the silence that followed, trying to process what I'd just learned. My husband, the man I thought I knew completely, had been carrying secrets that predated our entire marriage. He'd protected me from knowing about his father's mistakes, shielded me from family dynamics more complex than I'd imagined, and built an insurance policy that would keep us safe even after his death. On the desk lay a folder I hadn't noticed before, labeled simply Instructions. Inside were detailed notes about what to do if his siblings escalated their challenges, which lawyers to contact, which documents to reference, how to navigate every possible scenario. Marco had choreographed my defense like a chess master planning moves for a game he'd never see completed. But one instruction stood out, highlighted in his careful hand. If they directly threaten you or Alessia, if they move beyond legal challenges to intimidation, give Leone the signal. He knows what to do. Everything is documented. Everything is ready. I'm sorry you have to carry this, my love, but I trust you to finish what I started. I drove home through the Tuscan hills, watching the late afternoon sun paint everything gold and amber, and wondered something that both comforted and unsettled me. How many other secrets had Marco kept, and were they all to protect me, or was there more waiting to be discovered?
2 weeks passed before I heard from them again. This time it wasn't a visit, but a letter from their lawyer, a coldly professional document outlining their case for contesting the will. They claimed Marco had been under undue influence during his illness, that he'd been manipulated into cutting out his siblings, that the family business rightfully belonged to all of them. The letter was full of legal language and veiled threats, but the message was clear. Give them what they wanted, or face a long public court battle. I called Alessia that evening. She deserved to know what was happening. My daughter arrived the next morning, her face drawn with worry and anger. At 28, she had her father's thoughtful nature and my artistic temperament, a combination that made her sensitive to emotional undercurrents most people missed. "They're doing this now?" she asked, standing in the kitchen where she'd grown up. "While we're still grieving? While you're trying to figure out how to live without him?" "Your father expected this," I told her gently. "He prepared for it. But Alessia, there's something I need to show you. Something he left for both of us." We drove to Villa Serafina together. I'd told her only that her father had maintained a property there, that he'd left things for us to find. When Enzo opened the door, he smiled at Alessia with genuine warmth. "Signorina Alessia, your father spoke of you often. He was very proud of your work, your compassion. He wanted you to see this room too." She stood in the doorway of Marco's secret room, tears streaming down her face as she took in the photographs, the careful documentation of our lives. "He was planning this for years," she whispered. "All those times he seemed distant, preoccupied. He wasn't pulling away. He was building this." I handed her the journal. "Read it, all of it. Then listen to the recordings. Your father left us a roadmap, Alessia, not just for dealing with his siblings, but for understanding who he really was." Over the next hours, we sat together in that room, passing the journal between us, playing recordings, piecing together the elaborate structure Marco had built. Alessia was the one who found the third recording device, hidden inside a hollowed-out book of architectural drawings.
When we played it, Marco's voice was different again, lighter, almost happy. "My beautiful daughter," he began, and Alessia grabbed my hand. "By now you know about the troubles with my siblings, about the legal protections I put in place, but I don't want you to think that's all I was doing these last years. I was also preparing gifts, things I wanted you both to have, ways to continue living and creating, even when I couldn't be there with you." The recording directed us to a safe in the villa's cellar. Inside, we found documents that took my breath away. Marco had been quietly purchasing property not for investment, but for us. A small gallery space in the heart of Florence, perfect for Alessia's art. A restored stone cottage on the edge of our vineyard, designed as a private studio where I could return to my painting, something I'd given up years ago to focus on the business. But there was more. Bank accounts established in both our names, containing money he had carefully saved and invested over decades. Not vast wealth, but enough to give us freedom, security, independence. Detailed letters explaining each decision, each gift, each piece of the future he was trying to build for us. "I can't give you more time together," his recording continued. "That's the one thing I'd trade everything else for. Just one more year, one more month, one more day with you both. But I can give you this, the freedom to live fully, to create, to pursue what makes you happy without fear of financial ruin or family manipulation. Everything I built for this moment, for you to step forward into your own lives, carrying what we taught you, but not burdened by what others think you owe them." Alessia was crying openly now, and I pulled her close. We sat on the floor of that cellar, surrounded by our husband and father's final gifts, and grieved together in a way we hadn't been able to at the funeral. This was the real goodbye. Not the public ceremony, but this private discovery of how deeply he'd loved us, how carefully he'd tried to protect us. When we finally composed ourselves, Alessia said something that made everything clear. "They think they're fighting us for money and property, but what Papa really left us, what he really protected, they can never touch that. They don't even understand what it is." She was right. The legal documents, the property, the money, all of that mattered. But Marco's real legacy was in these rooms, in these recordings, in the evidence of a love so profound it had continued working to protect us even after death. His siblings could challenge all they wanted. They never possessed what Marco had given us, and they never would. Still, as we locked the villa behind us and drove home through the darkening hills, one question haunted me. Marco predicted his siblings' moves with such precision. Does that mean there was still more he anticipated? More challenges waiting that he'd already prepared us for?
If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next chapter of life, love, and redemption.
The answer came 3 months later, just as winter settled over the vineyard. Avvocato Leone called early one morning, his voice carrying a tension I hadn't heard before. "Signora Torini, they're escalating. Stefano has filed formal legal challenges, and I've learned they're planning to bring evidence that Marco was not of sound mind during his final years. They're claiming his illness affected his judgment." "That's ridiculous," I said. "You know how clear-headed he was. The journal alone proves—" "I know, and we'll win, but there's something else. I received a call yesterday from someone who claims to have documents showing irregularities in the family business from years ago. They're offering to sell this information to your husband's siblings." My blood ran cold. Someone's trying to sell them ammunition to use against us? Exactly, which means we need to move to the next phase of Marco's plan. He anticipated this moment. "Can you come to my office today?" In Leone's office in Siena, surrounded by law books and afternoon light filtering through ancient windows, I learned the full extent of what Marco had prepared.
The safety deposit box held not just documentation of his father's old mistakes, but something more powerful. Evidence that his siblings had known about these issues, had benefited from the questionable practices, and had never disclosed this when questioned during the will's initial probate. "Your husband was thorough," Leone explained, spreading documents across his desk. "These are dated records showing payments made to all three siblings during the period when the business was operating in the gray areas. They accepted money they knew came from questionable sources. They participated, even if peripherally. Marco documented everything, then spent years making it all legitimate. So, if they accuse Marco of building the business on corruption, they implicate themselves, and their legal challenge falls apart because they can't claim the high ground. They can't say Marco didn't deserve the inheritance while simultaneously benefiting from the very things they're condemning." Leone leaned back in his chair. "It's a perfect defensive position. Your husband was a master strategist." But then he pulled out one more folder, this one sealed with the same red wax as the original letter I'd found. "Marco gave this to me with specific instructions. It was to be given to you only if they attempted to intimidate you or Alessia directly. Have they done that?" I thought about the letter from their lawyer, the cold threats, the pressure. But then I remembered something else. A call Alessia had received 2 weeks ago. A man claiming to be a journalist, asking questions about Marco's business practices, about the family dynamics, questions that felt less like journalism and more like harassment. She had been shaken by it, though she tried to hide it from me. "Yes," I said quietly, "they're trying to frighten us." Leone broke the seal and read quickly, his expression shifting from professional interest to something like amazement. He really did think of everything. He looked up at me. "Señora, your husband established a trust not just for financial assets, but as a legal entity that holds all the business interests. The trust is irrevocable and names you and Alessia as the sole beneficiaries. But more importantly, the trust documents include a clause that if anyone attempts to challenge it through intimidation or harassment, they forfeit any potential claim forever." And Marco defined intimidation very broadly. "So they're destroying their own case? If we can prove the harassment, yes." But Marco went further. He also established a charitable foundation in the family name. If his siblings drop all legal challenges and sign a settlement agreement, the foundation will provide them each with a modest but permanent income. Not an inheritance, but a kind of pension. It's enough to live comfortably, but not enough to waste. The catch is that they have to acknowledge Marco's sole right to the business and publicly state that his will was just and proper. It was brilliant. Marco had given them a way out, a path to financial security that required only that they tell the truth and give up their greed. He had offered them dignity if they'd accept it. "What if they refuse?" I asked. Leone smiled grimly. "Then we released the documentation about their participation in the old business practices, not to prosecute them, the statute of limitations has long passed, but to show the court exactly who's challenging this will and why. It destroys their credibility and their case." I left Leone's office with a strange mixture of emotions. Pride in my husband's thorough planning, sadness that he'd felt forced to build such elaborate protections, and something else, a growing understanding that Marco had been teaching me something through all of this. He wasn't just protecting our assets, he was showing me how to stand firm, how to be both compassionate and unmovable, how to offer grace while maintaining boundaries. That night, I returned to Villa Serafina alone. Enzo had gone home and the villa was silent. I sat in Marco's room, surrounded by his carefully preserved memories, and finally allowed myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding.
Now that I understood all his preparations, all his secrets, what did I want to do with this knowledge? Marco had given me weapons, but he'd also given me choices. The question wasn't whether I could win this battle. His planning ensured that. The question was what kind of victory I wanted.
Leone presented the settlement offer to Stefano, Roberto, and Patrizia on a gray December morning. I wasn't there, but he called me immediately afterward to describe their reactions. Stefano looked ill, Leone said. He knows the game is over. Roberto tried to bluster, but when I showed him just a sample of the documentation, enough to make the point without revealing everything, he went quiet. Patrizia cried, but I think they were real tears this time. Shame, maybe, or regret. How long do they have to decide? I asked. 30 days. After that, we file everything with the court and let the process play out publicly. Marco was very clear on the timeline. The waiting was harder than the confrontation had been. I threw myself into the vineyard work, into preparations for the next growing season. Alessia came home for Christmas, and we spent quiet evenings in front of the fireplace, talking about her father, sharing memories I'd forgotten we had. She'd been reading his journal. I'd given her a copy. And one night she looked up from the pages with wonder in her eyes. "He wrote about every one of my gallery shows," she said softly, "even the ones he couldn't attend. He'd call the gallery afterward and ask them to describe it to him. Did you know that?" I hadn't. There were so many things I was still discovering about the man I'd shared my life with. It was like finding new rooms in a house you'd lived in for decades, each one revealing something you'd overlooked or never thought to question. On January 15th, Leone called again. "They're signing, all three of them. They want to meet with you first. They've requested a family meeting before the formal settlement." "Why?" I asked, immediately suspicious. "They say they want to apologize, to explain." I advised against it, but Marco's instructions included a provision for this possibility. He said if they ask to meet with you sincerely, you should consider giving them that chance. He believed in redemption, Signora, even for those who'd wronged him. So I agreed. We met at Villa Serafina, neutral ground and somehow fitting. Enzo prepared the main room, setting out chairs and coffee, then disappeared with his usual discretion. When Stefano, Roberto, and Patrizia arrived, they looked diminished somehow, smaller than they'd seemed in the vineyard that confrontational day months ago. Stefano spoke first. "Thank you for seeing us. You didn't have to. Marco wanted me to, if you came sincerely." Patrizia's hands twisted in her lap. "We were wrong, all of it. The challenge, the implications about Marco's judgment, the intimidation. We were desperate, and we convinced ourselves we were owed something. But reading the settlement documents, understanding everything Marco did to protect the business, to protect you, we see now what we refused to see before. We grew up poor. When Papa started making money, it felt like our chance to finally have what others had. And when he left everything to Marco, we felt cheated. But we were wrong to hold on to that bitterness for 30 years. Marco earned what he received. He built something from nothing, while we took easier paths and blamed him for our choices. I listened, searching their faces for sincerity or manipulation. What I saw was exhaustion, the weariness of people who'd been fighting a losing battle and finally understood it. "The settlement Marco arranged," Stefano continued, "it's more than fair. It's more than generous, considering what we've done. We're going to sign it. We're going to accept it. And we wanted to tell you something he never knew, something we should have said years ago." He paused, gathering courage. "We're proud of him. We're proud of what he built, of the man he became. We were just too bitter and ashamed of ourselves to admit it." I thought about Marco's recordings, his careful plans, his offer of financial security, paired with the requirement of truth. He'd understood his siblings better than they'd understood themselves.
He'd known that given the right pressure and the right incentive, they might finally be able to tell the truth, not just to me, but to themselves. He wanted to help you, I said quietly. That's what the foundation is for, not to buy your silence, but to give you a chance to live without the desperation that made you do things you're not proud of. He believed people could change, even when they'd hurt him. They left an hour later, having signed papers committing them to the settlement. I watched their car disappear down the Cypress Line Drive and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but a kind of peace. This was what Marco had wanted, not to destroy his siblings, but to protect us while still offering them a path back to dignity. It was mercy without weakness, strength without cruelty. That evening, I played the final recording I'd found in Marco's room, one I'd been saving. His voice was barely a whisper, clearly made in his last days. If you're listening to this, it means everything worked. They either accepted the settlement or the legal protections held them back. Either way, you're safe now. You and Alessia are free to build your lives without this weight. I'm sorry I had to leave you with one last task, with secrets and strategies and all of these complicated protections. I wanted to just love you simply, without all this planning and scheming. But love isn't always simple, is it? Sometimes it's complicated and difficult and requires us to be stronger than we want to be. He paused, and I could hear the emotion in his silence. Thank you for seeing this through. Thank you for being exactly who you are, strong enough to fight when you need to, wise enough to offer grace when you can. I love you, Juliana. I always have, I always will. Now go live the life we dreamed about. The recording ended, and I sat in the gathering darkness, crying and smiling at the same time. But one question remained, one last piece of the puzzle. What did I want to do now that the battle was over?
Spring came to the vineyard with explosive life, wildflowers carpeting the spaces between the vines, birds returning from wherever they'd spent the winter, the cypress trees seeming to stand straighter in the warming light. I'd spent the winter months in a kind of hibernation, processing everything that had happened, every revelation about Marco, every emotion I'd suppressed during the legal battles. Now, as the earth woke up, something was waking up in me, too. I started spending time in the stone cottage Marco had acquired for me, the one designated as my studio. For years, I told myself I didn't have time for painting, that the business and the vineyard demanded all my attention. But those had been excuses, ways of avoiding the vulnerability that art required. One morning, I set up an easel and stared at a blank canvas. My hands remembered the feel of a brush before my mind did. I started painting without a plan, just color and feeling, the texture of grief and gratitude mixed together. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and slowly something appeared on the canvas. Not a literal representation, but an emotional landscape. The golden hills of Tuscany merged with shadows and light, vines reaching upward like prayers, and in the center, a figure that might have been me or might have been anyone who'd ever loved and lost and found themselves still standing. Alessia came to visit in early March. She stood in my studio doorway looking at the paintings I'd been creating. I hadn't stopped with just one. And her eyes filled with tears. "Mama, these are beautiful. When did you start painting again?" When I finally understood what your father was trying to give me. Not just security or protection, but permission. Permission to be myself again, to create, to live fully instead of just surviving. She told me about the gallery space Marco had acquired for her, how she'd been slowly moving her work there, planning her first independent exhibition. She's calling it inheritance. Not about money or property, but about what we really receive from those who love us, their courage, their wisdom, their belief in who we can become. That summer, the vineyard produced its finest harvest in years. I hired help for the work I couldn't manage alone, delegating in ways I'd been too controlling to do before.
The wine we made that year had a depth I couldn't quite explain. The winemaker said it was the quality of the grapes, the perfect weather, but I wondered if it was something else. Something about tending those vines with new understanding, new appreciation for what Marco had planted. On what would have been our 24th anniversary, I returned to Villa Serafina one last time. Enzo greeted me with his quiet smile. I've been maintaining it as Signor Marco requested, but Signora, I think perhaps it's time to ask, what do you want to do with this place? I walked through the rooms, touching furniture, looking at the photographs in Marco's secret room. The villa had served its purpose. It had held the mysteries I needed to solve, the messages I needed to receive. But it didn't need to be a shrine. Life was for the living. I'd like to transform it, I told Enzo, into a retreat space for artists and writers, people who need quiet time to create, to think, to heal. Keep Marco's room intact, make it part of the story of this place, but the rest, let it live again. Let it serve beauty instead of just holding memories. Enzo's smile widened. Signor Marco would love that. He always said beauty was the only thing worth building for. I found one final letter that day, tucked into a book on architecture I'd never opened before. It was dated from a year before Marco's death, written in his careful hand. My dearest Juliana, if you found this, it means you've worked through all the practical matters, the legal challenges, the family complications, all the tedious but necessary protections I put in place. Now, I want to tell you something more important than any of that. When I learned I was dying, my first emotion was anger, not at God or fate or the universe, but at time itself. It wasn't enough. All the years we had weren't enough. I wanted decades more with you, wanted to see Alessia's children, wanted to grow old watching sunsets from our terrace. But then I realized something else. Most people never get what we had. Most people go through their whole lives without experiencing love that's truly safe, truly seen, truly cherished. We had that. We built that together. And nothing, not death, not family conflict, not even time can take that away. It lives in you. It lives in Alessia. It lives in the vineyard and the art and every choice we made to create beauty instead of merely pursuing comfort. Don't make the mistake I almost made. Don't spend whatever years you have left living in the past, honoring my memory by freezing yourself in grief. Honor me by living fully, by creating boldly, by opening yourself to joy even when it feels risky. That's what I really want for you, not just security, but freedom. The freedom to become whoever you're meant to be next. I love you. I've always loved you. I'll always love you. But my love was never meant to be a cage. It was meant to be wings. Fly, my darling, fly. I stood on the villa's terrace, watching the sun set over the Tuscan hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The letter trembled in my hands, but my heart felt steady for the first time since Marco's death. He'd given me so much. Protection, wisdom, security, truth. But this final gift might have been the most precious. Permission to live fully, not as his widow, but as myself. As twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, I whispered a question into the warm evening air. Who would I become now that I was finally, fully free?
On Alessia's opening night at her new gallery, I stood among strangers and friends, watching people move from painting to painting, hearing them speak in hushed, reverent tones about her work. She'd created a series exploring invisible inheritances, love, loss, resilience, the ways we carry those who've left us. One piece in particular made people stop and stare. A portrait of hands, weathered and strong, holding a single cypress seed. The placard read simply, "What my father planted." I thought about Marco constantly, but differently now, not with the sharp, breathless grief of those first months, but with a tender gratitude for all he'd been and all he'd given. The legal battles were resolved. The vineyard thrived. My studio overflowed with paintings I hadn't known I had in me. The villa was being transformed, soon to welcome its first residents, artists seeking the same kind of renewal I'd found there. His siblings sent cards on holidays now, brief but sincere. The foundation provided them with enough to live comfortably, and I'd heard through Leone that Patrizia had gone back to school, that Roberto had started volunteering at a community center. Small redemptions, but real ones. Marco would have been pleased. Late one evening after Alessia's successful opening, I sat on our terrace with a glass of wine from that exceptional harvest. The vineyard stretched before me in the moonlight, row after row of vines Marco had planted with his own hands, each one a prayer for our future. He couldn't have known then that his future would be cut short, that those vines would outlive him. But he'd planted them anyway, with faith and love and hope. That's what I understood now. What all his secrets and strategies and careful planning had really been about, not control from beyond the grave, but one last act of planting. He couldn't give me more time, couldn't stay to see what bloomed from the seeds he had scattered, but he prepared the soil, cleared away the weeds, and trusted that something beautiful would grow. I'd spent so much of the past year uncovering his mysteries, following his clues, learning about sides of him I'd never fully known. But in the end, the greatest discovery wasn't about him at all. It was about me, about my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity to stand firm and offer grace, to fight when necessary and forgive when possible, to honor the past while embracing the future. When I looked in the mirror now, I saw someone different from the woman who'd found that first letter. I saw someone who'd walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, grief leaves marks that never fully fade, but transformed, stronger, clearer, more fully myself than I had ever been. Marco used to say that great architecture isn't about the building itself, but about the space it creates for people to live fully. That's what he'd done with his elaborate plans and protections, not built walls to trap me in the past, but created space for me to step into a future he'd never see. He'd given me a foundation solid enough to support whatever I chose to build upon it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I felt him near, not as a ghost or a presence, but as a kind of warmth, a certainty that love doesn't end when the heart stops beating. It simply changes form. It becomes the courage to open your studio after years of silence, the strength to face down those who take what isn't theirs, the wisdom to offer redemption to those who've wronged you, the freedom to paint and plant and live without fear. True love doesn't end when the heart stops beating, I whispered to the stars, remembering words from one of his recordings. It simply changes form. And standing there in the vineyard he'd planted, in the life we'd built together, surrounded by beauty that would outlast us both, I finally understood what he'd meant. His love hadn't disappeared, it had transformed into everything around me. The vines, the art, the future stretching out like an open road. He was gone, but what he'd planted in me, in Alessia, in the very soil beneath my feet, would continue growing long after all of us had turned to dust. I raised my glass to the moon, to the vineyard, to the man who loved me enough to plan for a future he'd never share. And then I turned toward the house, toward my studio, toward whatever came next, carrying his love not as a weight, but as wings. The question that had haunted me for months, what had Marco been protecting me from, finally had its answer.
Not from his family's greed or legal challenges or financial ruin, though he'd prepared for all of that. He'd been protecting me from the belief that my story ended when his did, that grief was where they should stop instead of where I'd begin again. And so I asked myself one final question, the only one that mattered anymore. What beautiful thing would I plant today?
If this story touched your heart and you'd like to support this work, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every small gesture helps bring more stories like this one to life. Thank you for listening, and remember, your kindness makes stories possible.